and that's spreading. That's great.
Kumi.
I just wanted to respond to George a bit there. While I agree with most of what you say, and I also agree with the point that I want to draw attention to, that in fact the old North-South dichotomies do not hold exactly in the same way. I don't think they're irrelevant. I think they're really, really still the major driver of these negotiations. Of course, it's different now because you've got big emerging countries like, by the way, I hate this term, emerging countries. What are we? We always wear there as if we suddenly emerged, right? But in any case, we all get trapped in the language. But countries that are finding their rightful place in the global economy, perhaps, the situation is different. But one of the questions that I want to put to you, because, you know, I agree very much when you say we need to work in collaborative partnership and so on, but the difficulty that Greenpeace and other civil society organizations have with both business and government is that they seem to ignore what Albert Einstein once said. Albert Einstein said, if you're trying to fix a big problem, don't use the same logic thinkings and frameworks that got you in the problem in the first place. And essentially, all that we see governments and business doing is putting a band-aid over the problem and hoping that it will go away. So I just, and just to be quite transparent, I mean, I get criticized from both sides. I get criticized sometimes by people saying Greenpeace should be engaging more with business. I get criticized from the other side saying Greenpeace should be even not talking to business at all. When I went to the World Economic Forum as the first time in my Greenpeace hat, I was completely surprised because there were so many people from the CEOs wanted to meet me, because when I used to go as a human rights and anti-poverty campaign and nobody wanted to actually sit down and have a conversation with me. So one CEO I got to a bit late, I said, I'm sorry man, it's a new situation, everybody has scheduled me and I'm running from one meeting to the other. He said, no, don't worry Kumi, I understand the problem you have. I said, what you mean? He said, well, everybody is desperate, all my CEOs are desperate to get Greenpeace at the table because they hope that way they won't be on your menu. but seriously,
I get your point.
Yeah, but I have a more fundamental question to raise with you, right? Because, you know, I really support what you're trying to do, and you know this, we've talked for many years. But isn't there a real problem with the DNA of business? Because in the DNA of business is more profit, more markets, more products, more, you know, more. In fact, we need to actually shift that model, firstly, to do more with less. And I think enlightened, progressive business leaders have got that we need to do more with less. But simply doing more with less is not good enough. How do you deal with this contradiction of reducing meaningless production and consumption that the business community actually pushes down the throat?
I share your sense of frustration on occasions. I'm very impatient myself. I believe there are two systemic deficiencies in the marketplace. One is the obsession with short-term returns, and we have discussed this at length. And how do you shift the signals from short-term to long-term is fundamentally important. If you make investment decisions based on 20 years projections, you integrate actually environmental considerations much more. If you think only about 3 months ahead, you don't care. You just want to make a quick buck. So one is time frame. Fundamentally difficult, and we're working on that, but the whole system, the old system is geared on short-term. We have to change that. The second one is the valuation, and you talked about it already. It's true that market signals just don't integrate sufficiently the true costs, especially on the natural environment. We are still in the old paradigm, like everything is free and we can dump it and throw it away. It's no longer true. But that change is starting to happen, the pricing change. And we're working very hard to push for emission pricing, carbon pricing, and in the end we need it. And we have to work towards a global framework at the end, and that's where climate change comes in, and we all know how painful it is. Now, business is moving, but is the pace fast enough? I would also agree, no, it's not. And you have to also understand that large corporations are very complex organizations. It's almost like a mini-state in its own. So even when the CEO says, as of today, you know, I want to change my operations, until it reaches the subsidiaries and the supply chains, it's a long way to go. Think about, reform of big organizations. So are we moving fast enough? No. Are we doing enough? No. What can we do better? I would go back also to especially the consumers and the people, and I would say just choose more carefully. Think about what you consume and how you consume. Think about what values you yourself are. It sounds now a bit pathetic, but I turned vegetarian 3 years ago, and I did it for health reasons more than anything else. But I'm also happy to know that this has a huge positive footprint. Yeah.
So we won't see you at Kentucky Fried Chicken anytime soon.
I,
So we've got 5 minutes left. Let's talk about the future. I think one of the really interesting things about this conversation, and I think one of the interesting things about social media is instinctively future tense. Social media, you speak to what Mashable calls the connected generation. They all talk about not what they should have done or what they did do. They talk about what they're going to do. They talk about the next 20 years. And in the sense of the conversations I've been having with people here locally, they're all about people looking forward. And actually it's a really interesting counter-narrative about people thinking not Rio+20, but today plus 20. Today plus 20, what are we going to get right for the next 20 years? So in the last 5 minutes we've got together, let's talk a little bit about, particularly given the wide experience you guys have in terms of making the world a better place, what should the people now beginning their careers in social good, what should they be thinking about as they're trying to put right the things in the next 20 years, the things you think we haven't got right in the last 20 years?
Well, first, I think young people should not vest any faith in the current brand of adult leadership that exists in the world. They should not accept that they are the leaders of tomorrow. They should assert that, in fact, they are the leaders of today and actually bring new vision and new ways and new imagination of addressing these problems. The problem is, as my daughter sometimes says to me when I say, darling, you should do this, she said, Dad, based on my experience, you should do this. She said, Dad, you are contaminated by bad experience and you push it onto us. And that's what's happening. I want to be blunt. The current leadership, 20 years ago, maybe the evidence was not clear about how serious things are. The evidence now is very clear. It's not as if climate impacts are not happening and taking lives now. Right? It's happening now, and the people that are paying the first and most brutal price are those that have been least responsible. So given that reality, I would safely say that the current bunch of adult leadership is the biggest bunch of losers that young people are going to find. My main message to you is come up with new ideas, imagine a new world, and do not be restricted by the current frames of thinking, because the current frames of thinking are going to lead us to disaster. And we need fresh thinking. That's the one important thing. The second thing is fight for your spaces, for your voice. And be careful to make the distinction between access versus influence. What I mean is, there are young people here at Rio. There are people who got registration and so on. And just because we're inside with some level of access doesn't mean we have influence. So the one thing I would say is think carefully about what constitutes real access and what constitutes influence, and focus on those things that give you more space to have influence.
Georg, I'm going to give you the last word. What's the one piece of advice for the next 20 years?
Look for wisdom. I wouldn't restrict it just to young people. I'm thinking of my dead grandmother, who probably was the best environmental steward I have ever come across. I'm thinking of many very wise people, yesterday Maurice Strong, but all over the world. I hope we learn also from the past. I hope we don't forget the lessons of the past. Of course, we have to look for innovations and new things, and my advice is also look into technology. I do believe that innovation and technology is a big part of the answer for the future. So don't forget the sciences, the hard sciences as well.
Thank you so much, Kumi and Georg. The future is wiser, the future is more social. That was a great start to our day. Thanks for joining us.